In the autumn of 1944, as Allied armies closed in from the west and Soviet forces smashed through the east, a single decision made by one German officer would seal the fate of millions. His name was Otto Ernst Remer, a decorated combat veteran, a true believer, a man who chose loyalty over reason. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded inside Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. The Führer survived, and in the chaotic hours that followed, Germany's military resistance, men who had spent years planning to overthrow the Nazi regime and end the war, stood on the edge of success. But Major Remer, commanding the Berlin Guard Battalion, was given a choice: follow the orders of his superior officers and arrest the Nazi leadership, or believe the voice on the other end of a telephone line claiming to be Adolf Hitler himself. His decision would destroy the conspiracy. It would doom the plotters. And it would condemn Europe to 9 more months of slaughter, genocide, and total destruction. How did a mid-ranking officer become the man who saved Hitler? What was this conspiracy, and how close did it come to ending the Third Reich? And what if Remer had chosen differently? To understand how we got here, we have to go back to the beginning. By the summer of 1944, Nazi Germany was dying. The Eastern Front had collapsed. On June 22nd, exactly 3 years after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet summer offensive, codenamed Operation Bagration, tore through Army Group Center like a hurricane through kindling. In 5 weeks, the Red Army destroyed 28 German divisions, killed or captured 400,000 men, and advanced 400 miles westward. The Wehrmacht retreat became a rout. In the west, the Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6. By late July, American and British forces were breaking out of the beachhead. Paris would fall within weeks. The 1,000-year Reich was being crushed between 2 unstoppable armies. Inside Germany's cities, Allied bombers turned entire neighborhoods into smoking craters. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. The home front was collapsing. Food shortages spread, and the SS tightened its grip, executing anyone suspected of defeatism. But even as the Nazi state devoured itself, Adolf Hitler remained in absolute control. Isolated in his field headquarters, surrounded by sycophants, he refused every suggestion of peace talks or strategic retreat. His orders became increasingly detached from reality. Hold every inch of ground. No withdrawal. No surrender. Fight to the last man. And Germany's generals, the men commanding armies in the field, watched in horror as their Führer led the nation toward apocalypse. For years, some of these officers had been quietly discussing what was once unthinkable: removing Hitler from power. Not out of moral awakening, not because they suddenly opposed the war they had helped wage, but because they saw the mathematical certainty of total defeat and believed only a change in leadership could save Germany from utter annihilation. These men were not Democrats. Many had enthusiastically served the regime. Some had committed war crimes. But by 1944, they believed Hitler was leading Germany toward extinction, and they decided to act. The conspiracy had a name: Operation Valkyrie, and its leader was a decorated war hero named Claus von Stauffenberg. Colonel Claus Schenkgraf von Stauffenberg was 36 years old in July 1944. Tall, charismatic, with a sharp mind and aristocratic bearing, he came from an old Bavarian noble family. He'd been a rising star in the Wehrmacht, a brilliant staff officer who'd served in Poland, France, and North Africa. In April 1943, his vehicle struck a mine in Tunisia. The blast nearly killed him. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. Months of painful recovery followed, and somewhere in that darkness, his faith in Adolf Hitler shattered. When Stauffenberg returned to duty in late 1943, he was assigned to the replacement army, the reserve force responsible for training and mobilizing reinforcements inside Germany. It was a headquarters post in Berlin, far from the front, but it gave him access to something more valuable than any battlefield command: proximity to Hitler. Stauffenberg soon connected with a network of military officers, civil servants, and former politicians who had been quietly organizing for years. Men like General Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the General Staff, who resigned in 1938 over Hitler's reckless war plans. Karl Gordeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who envisioned a post-Hitler Germany restored to something resembling rule of law. Their plan was layered and ambitious. First, assassinate Hitler. Second, use Operation Valkyrie, an existing emergency protocol designed to mobilize the reserve army in case of internal uprising, to seize control of Berlin, arrest the Nazi leadership, and take command of the government. Third, open negotiations with the Western Allies for a conditional peace. It was desperate, it was dangerous, and it required perfect timing. Several attempts had already failed. Bombs hidden in Hitler's plane never detonated. Suicide bombers lost their nerve. Meetings were canceled at the last minute. Security around the Führer was suffocating. The SS watched everyone. But on July 11th, 1944, Stauffenberg was promoted to colonel and appointed chief of staff to General Friedrich from commander of the replacement army. Suddenly, Stauffenberg had regular access to Hitler's military briefings. He could carry papers, files, and a briefcase into the Führer's inner sanctum. And inside that briefcase, he could carry a bomb. The conspirators set a date, July 20th, 1944. Stauffenberg would attend Hitler's midday briefing at the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters deep in the forests of East Prussia near the town of Rassenberg. Stauffenberg would detonate the bomb. Hitler would die. And in the confusion, the conspirators in Berlin would launch Valkyrie, arrest Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and the Nazi leadership, and take control of the government and the armed forces. It was Germany's last chance to stop the madness, and everything depended on what happened next. July 20th, 1944. Morning. Klaus von Stauffenberg woke early at his quarters in Berlin. He dressed in his uniform, gathered his papers, and carefully packed 2 explosive devices into his briefcase. British-made plastic explosives, fitted with pencil detonators. Silent, reliable, deadly. He modified the briefcase himself. With only 3 fingers on his left hand, he'd practice again and again how to arm the detonator, close the case, position it near Hitler. At 7 a.m., he and his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, boarded a Heinkel He-111 bomber and flew east toward Rassenberg. The flight took 3 hours. At the Wolf's Lair, security was tight but predictable. Stauffenberg had been there before. He knew the routines. Officers attending the briefing passed through checkpoints, but their briefcases weren't searched. The SS trusted the Wehrmacht's senior staff. Shortly before 12:30 p.m., Stauffenberg excused himself to an anteroom to freshen up. In truth, he was arming the bomb. With Haeften's help, he crushed the glass vial inside the pencil detonator. Acid began eating through a thin wire. In 10 minutes, the wire would break, releasing a spring-loaded firing pin. The bomb would explode. But there was a problem. Stauffenberg had only armed one of the 2 devices. Interruptions, nerves, time pressure. He couldn't risk delaying any longer. 1 bomb would have to be enough. At 12:37 p.m., Stauffenberg entered the briefing room, a low wooden building with large windows and thin walls. Not the reinforced concrete bunker where Hitler usually held meetings. The bunker was being renovated. Today's briefing was in a temporary structure. The room was hot, crowded with officers standing around a large oak map table. Hitler stood at the center, hunched over maps of the Eastern Front, listening to reports of Soviet advances. Stauffenberg moved close. He set his briefcase down under the table, as near to Hitler as possible, less than 6 feet away. Then he muttered an excuse about an urgent phone call and slipped out of the room. The officers continued their discussions. The minutes ticked by. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The blast was deafening. The wooden building disintegrated. Smoke, fire, and flying debris filled the air. Bodies were thrown across the room. Papers ignited. Men screamed. Stauffenberg, already outside and moving toward a waiting car, saw the explosion, saw the flames, saw the chaos. He was certain no one could have survived that. He and Haeften bluffed their way past security checkpoints, claiming urgent orders, and raced the airfield. By 1:15 p.m., they were airborne, flying back to Berlin. Hitler was dead. The conspiracy could begin. Except Hitler wasn't dead. Inside the shattered briefing room, for men lay dead or dying, Hitler's stenographer, an army general, 2 other officers. A dozen more were wounded, some critically, but Adolf Hitler was alive. By pure chance, another officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, had moved Stauffenberg's briefcase. Finding it in his way, he nudged it to the far side of the heavy oak table leg. That table leg, combined with the thin walls and open windows that allowed the blast to dissipate outward, had shielded Hitler from the worst of the explosion. The Führer staggered from the wreckage, his trousers shredded, his hair singed, his eardrums ruptured. But he was conscious, furious, and very much alive. Within minutes, the Wolf's Lair went into lockdown. No one in or out. SS guards swarmed the compound. Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and other Nazi leaders rushed to the scene. And back in Berlin, 500 miles away, the conspirators waited for confirmation. For hours, there was confusion. Initial reports were contradictory. Some said Hitler was dead. Others said he'd survived. Communications between Rassenberg and Berlin were fragmentary. The plotters gathered at the Benler block. The War Office headquarters in central Berlin had to make a decision without certainty. General Friedrich Albert, one of the senior conspirators, made the call. At 4 p.m., he activated Operation Valkyrie. Orders went out to military districts across Germany. A coup was underway. The SS had staged an uprising. The Wehrmacht must seize control, arrest Nazi officials, and restore order. In Berlin, the Guard Battalion, the Grossdeutschland Watch Battalion, was the key, commanded by Major Otto Ernst Remer. This unit of 600 elite soldiers was responsible for guarding government buildings in the capital. If Remer followed orders, the conspirators could secure Berlin before the SS could react. Otto Ernst Remer was 32 years old, a combat veteran of the Eastern Front, holder of the Knight's Cross for bravery, a loyal soldier, and a true believer in Adolf Hitler. At 4 p.m., Remer received his orders from Lieutenant Colonel Otto Hagen of Albrecht's staff. Cordon off the government quarter, arrest Joseph Goebbels, and secure key ministries. Remer obeyed. He moved his troops into position. By early evening, soldiers surrounded Goebbels' official residence. But something didn't feel right. Remer was a field soldier, not a politician. The orders felt strange, confusing. Arresting a cabinet minister? On whose authority? And why was the Wehrmacht moving against the government? Remer decided to investigate. At approximately 6:30 p.m., he went directly to Joseph Goebbels' residence, not to arrest him, but to ask what was happening. It was a decision that saved the Nazi regime. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, was one of Hitler's most cunning loyalists. When Remer entered his office, Goebbels saw an opportunity. Instead of resisting arrest, he picked up the telephone and placed a call to the Wolf's Lair, to Adolf Hitler. Goebbels handed the phone to Remer, and on the other end of the line, a voice, hoarse, furious, unmistakable, spoke. "Do you recognize my voice?" Remer stammered. "Yes, my Führer. There has been an assassination attempt by a clique of treasonous officers. I am alive. I am giving you a direct order. Restore order in Berlin. Crush the coup. Arrest everyone involved. You are now under my personal command." And then, in a moment that would haunt history, Hitler promoted Remer on the spot, from major to colonel. Remer saluted the telephone, and the conspiracy collapsed. By 7 p.m., Major Remer, now Colonel Remer, had reversed his orders. His Guard Battalion turned on the conspirators. Troops surrounded the Benler block. The men who, hours earlier, believed they were saving Germany now found themselves trapped inside their own headquarters. Inside the building, chaos reigned. Stauffenberg had returned from Rassenberg, still believing Hitler was dead. He and the other plotters worked frantically to maintain control, issuing orders, trying to rally support. But the momentum had shifted. Many Wehrmacht officers, uncertain and confused, chose to wait. Others, learning that Hitler was alive, refused to act. And General Friedrich, from Stauffenberg's superior, who had known about the conspiracy but refused to commit, saw a chance to save himself. From turn on the plotters, he declared them traitors, ordered their immediate arrest, and convened a hasty drumhead court-martial inside the Bendler block. At 11 p.m., the verdict was announced: death by firing squad. There would be no trial, no defense, no appeal. In the courtyard of the Bendler block, lit by the headlights of a Wehrmacht truck, 5 men were executed: Klaus von Stauffenberg, Friedrich Albrecht, Werner von Haften, Albrecht Mertz von Kornheim, and Ludwig Beck, who was allowed to shoot himself but botched it and had to be finished by a sergeant. Stauffenberg's last words, shouted into the darkness as the rifles leveled at him, were, "Long live sacred Germany!" The shots rang out, the bodies fell, and with them died Germany's last chance to end the war. In the days and weeks that followed, the Nazi regime unleashed a campaign of vengeance unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever seen. The Gestapo arrested over 7,000 people. Hundreds were executed, hanged, shot, or tortured to death in Gestapo cellars. The trials were sadistic spectacles. Men were hung from meat hooks with piano wire, slowly strangled while cameras filmed their agonies for Hitler to watch. Families of the conspirators were arrested under Sippenhaft, blood guilt, and sent to concentration camps. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was implicated. Though his involvement was peripheral, he was given a choice: public trial and execution, with his family arrested, or suicide with a promise of a state funeral and protection for his wife and son. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took poison. The regime called a heart attack. The conspiracy was eradicated, and Adolf Hitler, more paranoid and isolated than ever, tightened his grip. The failure of the July 20th plot condemned Europe to 9 more months of hell. Had the conspiracy succeeded, had Hitler died, had the Wehrmacht taken control, had Remer followed his orders and arrested Goebbels, what might have followed? The plotters planned to open peace negotiations with the Western Allies. They hoped to end the war, withdraw from occupied territories in the West, and focus German forces on the Eastern Front to slow the Soviet advance. It was a desperate plan built on wishful thinking. The Allies had already announced their policy: unconditional surrender. Churchill and Roosevelt had no interest in negotiating with any German government. But even if peace was impossible, the coup might have saved lives. Because without Hitler, the Nazi regime's final spasms of genocidal violence might have ended sooner. In the 9 months after July 20th, the Holocaust accelerated. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Death marches emptied the camps as the SS tried to hide evidence of their crimes. Tens of thousands of prisoners died of starvation, exposure, and bullets in the snow. On the battlefield, Hitler's refusal to retreat cost hundreds of thousands more lives. German armies were encircled and destroyed. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive in the West, wasted the Reich's final reserves and achieved nothing. Soviet forces reached Berlin in April 1945. The city became a charnel house. Block-by-block combat, artillery barges, mass rapes. The Red Army showed no mercy. And Hitler, hiding in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, continued issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself. 9 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but the cost of those final 9 months was almost unimaginable. Over 2 million people, soldiers, civilians, prisoners, died between July 1944 and May 1945. Cities were obliterated. Entire populations were displaced. And the hatred and division sown by the war's final chapter would shape the Cold War that followed. And Otto Ernst Remer, the major who saved Hitler? Remer survived the war. He was captured by the Americans in 1945, spent a few years in custody, and was released. In the 1950s, he became active in neo-Nazi politics, founding extremist parties and denying the Holocaust. He fled Germany in the 1990s to avoid prosecution for inciting racial hatred. He died in Spain in 1997, unrepentant and defiant to the end. History has not been kind to Otto Ernst Remer. He is remembered not as a hero, but as a man who had the power to change everything, and chose blind loyalty instead. The July 20th plotters, for all their flaws and moral compromises, are now honored in Germany as men who tried to stop the madness. Memorials stand at the Benler Block. Streets bear their names. They were not saints. Many had served the regime willingly, but in the end, they chose resistance. And we're left with the question, what if? What if Remer had followed his orders? What if he'd arrested Goebbels instead of listening to Hitler's voice on that telephone? What if the coup had succeeded? We'll never know. But we do know this. In the summer of 1944, one man was given a choice, and his decision ensured that the war and all its horrors would grind on to the bitter end. Sometimes history turns on a single moment, a single voice, a single act of loyalty or betrayal, and sometimes the wrong choice destroys the last hope the world had left.